Kathleen, you are good to go whenever you are ready.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Understanding Maine's Public Utilities Commission. Maine's Climate Action Plan calls for a rapid transition to renewable energy, beneficial electrification of transportation and heating, and a modernized electric grid system to support those changes. Many of the key decisions about our energy future will take place at the Public Utilities Commission. We are delighted to have recently appointed PUC Commissioner Patrick Scully with us today to explain exactly what the PUC does and why it's poised to play such a vital role in shaping Maine's clean energy future. Welcome, thank you for joining us, Commissioner. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters, Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speaker first and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and ask those during the Q&A at the end. You can message Will Sedlak with any technical difficulties and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all for joining us, and Commissioner, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks Kathleen, and welcome everyone. I'm going to take, see if I can make this work, share my screen with you all, and there. So what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit on who I am, what the PUC is, what its job is, what we do, and how we do it. And I'll try to cover that briefly, and then really focus in my comments on the work at the Commission that relates to renewable energy and relates to addressing climate change and the achievement of the state's climate-related goals. So if that sounds all right, I will get started. And I know we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. It's going to be a bit of a challenge for me. Some of you will know some of what I'm covering better than I do, and for others it will be new information, and we'll just do the best we can as we go through it. So I'm going to, let's see, try another version of this. I think I must have grabbed the wrong version. There we go. Now let's see if it works. There we go. So this is just an overmap of where I'm going, a quick introduction, our mission, our jurisdiction, how we work, and then shifting to renewable and climate related issues, what our goals are, where we are to date with respect to renewable power, the various renewable related programs that the Commission has implemented or is implementing, and a few other topics involving transportation, some of our more important current dockets on grid modernization and rate design, and a little bit of public participation at the end. So that's me. The picture of me that Kathleen showed you was a younger me, so I appreciate that, Kathleen. This is more recent. I was appointed to the Commission this past June, so I'm a newbie. Prior to that, I was an attorney at the Portland-based firm of Bernstein Schur, where most of my practice was in municipal energy and utility regulatory law. I did a lot of work over the years representing developers, owners, and operators of renewable generation in Maine and New England, and represented the Maine Renewable Energy Association. The rest of this is just blah, blah, so I'll move on. Mission of the Commission, and this is, the Maine PUC was created by the legislature, and it is the legislature that determines what our job is. And at its core, our obligation is to ensure safe, adequate, and reliable utility service at rates that are reasonable to customers. And I would emphasize, we also charge to make sure that rates are reasonable to the utilities. That is to say that the utilities can earn a fair return on their investment. And that's the balance we have to strike. More recently, the legislature explicitly added the last clause, which is while also helping to achieve reductions in the state's greenhouse gas emissions. What do we regulate? We regulate electric transmission and distribution utilities. And just a reminder that about 20 years ago, Maine passed a law that required the utilities to sell off all their generation. So utilities like CMP and Versant, which is the successor to Emera and Bangor Hydro, they are just delivery companies. They don't produce electricity. They don't sell you electricity. They deliver electricity to you, and they charge you for the use of their wires and poles and other equipment for delivering that energy to you. We also regulate natural gas utilities like Northern Utilities, Summit Natural Gas, Maine Natural Gas, and Bangor Gas. We represent water utilities. For those of you who are served by a local water utility, there are many dozens of publicly owned water utilities across Maine and some privately investor-owned water utilities. We have limited regulation over telephone service and essentially just the kind of basic dial-up service, what we call provider of last resort service. Many of the other aspects of telephone service now operate in a very competitive environment and they're not subject to our regulation. We manage the E911 service in Maine, and the Emergency Services Bureau is a division within the Public Utilities Commission. And finally, we have jurisdiction over the rates and services in Casco Bay for ferry and water transportation. Just as important as what we regulate is what we don't regulate. We don't regulate cable TV. We don't regulate wireless phones. We don't regulate broadband service, sewer districts or sewer service. And while we regulate water utilities, we don't regulate the quality of the water that you get from your water utility. That's regulated by the Drinking Water Program, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. The reason we don't regulate any of these things is because the legislature hasn't given us the authority. How do we operate? We are a quasi-judicial agency, and which means that in certain cases, what we call adjudicatory cases, we are essentially three judges who decide the cases based on the facts and the evidence that's presented to us. So those adjudicatory utility cases, including things like rate cases, where a utility is seeking an increase or a change in their rates, borrowing by a utility, infrastructure, major infrastructure projects, mergers and acquisitions, other financial transactions. Those are examples of what we call adjudicatory cases, where we, at the conclusion of essentially the trial before the commission, we decide the case. We also conduct inquiries and formal investigations. We adopt rules, and the commission has a significant number of rules that it has adopted over the years to implement our legislative directive. We enforce the laws and rules that are on the books. We also procure standard offer supply. If you are a residential customer and you haven't picked a competitive supplier, then your energy actually comes from a standard offer supplier. And every year the PUC conducts an RFP process, a bidding process to obtain that backup or standard offer supply service. We also have a role, which I'll talk about in a bit, in procuring renewable power projects in Maine as directed by the legislature. And finally, we also advocate for consumers in our regional and federal environments. In Maine is part of the New England larger electricity market managed by an entity called ISO New England. We advocate in front of ISO New England, and we advocate at the federal level before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Just wanted to talk about transparency. Our proceedings are open to the public. The public can attend proceedings of the PUC in person, but we also live stream through our website, our hearings, our technical conferences, our rulemaking proceedings, the deliberations where the commission decides things, usually every Tuesday morning. And so we've tried to be as available to the public as we can be. I think there's more work to be done there. And we are upgrading our website. So we'll hopefully have a new website out within the next few weeks. So to shift to kind of climate and renewable energy related topics, I just wanted to quickly summarize what our current renewable energy goals are as established by the legislature, that by January 1, 2030, 80% of all retail sales of electricity in Maine will come from renewable resources. Interestingly enough, as I'll show you in a couple of moments, we're a long ways towards meeting that goal, and in some years we've met it. The second goal is that by January 1, 2050, 100% of retail sales will come from renewable resources. The governor has also established a goal of the state being carbon neutral by 2045. This pie chart shows installed capacity of generation in Maine, and I want to distinguish. Installed capacity basically means if you looked at every generator, every power plant, what's the maximum amount of power that it could produce at any moment in time if it was operating at full power. This shows you what the capacity of all of our Maine-based generators are by fuel type. And if you look at it, it seems a little depressing because it shows that about over 60% of our current generation capacity comes from either natural gas or oil. And that's because we built a lot of that in the past, although as you'll find out in a moment, much of that doesn't run very often. So even though it's there, it doesn't run as much as you might think. And if you look at the very bottom two lines, you'll see our total installed capacity is just under 5,000 megawatts. That's the amount of power that could be produced if all of our power plants, including solar and wind and hydro, if they were all running at their max capacity at one moment in time, which doesn't happen. And our total load, the peak load, the most power we're demanding on the hottest early evening in the middle of the summer is just over 2,000 megawatts. So you can see we've got quite a bit more capacity than our peak demand. This pie chart shows you our actual generation, that is the actual power that's produced by these power plants by fuel type. This is a little bit more positive picture from a climate perspective. And this is 2020 data, which shows that 81% of the generation from Maine-based power plants came from renewable resources. The biggest chunk from hydro, followed by wind. The yellow slice up around 11 o'clock is entitled Other Renewable. That's mostly biomass. There's a very narrow red stripe at noon on the top of that pie chart, which is solar. In 2020, that was a relatively small amount of production, but as I'll get to in a moment, we're building an awful lot of solar in Maine right now, and so I expect in future years that slice of the pie is going to get a lot bigger. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that the total amount of generation in 2020 by Maine-based generators was a little over 8,000 gigawatt hours of generation, whereas Maine's total load, the amount of power we consumed, was 12,000 plus of gigawatt hours. And so the curious part of that is we actually were a net importer of power into Maine in 2020. And the major reason for that is that we operate as part of a regional energy market system. And in any given day, at any given hour, the generators that supply our demand are chosen based upon price. And so at some hours of the year, we may be importing either from New Brunswick, which we often do, or from other parts of New England, because the generation that's available there to supply us is available at a lower price than some of the generation that's based in Maine. So that's the principal reason. There are other reasons as well. But overall, this is telling us, I think, that in terms of where we're headed, we're certainly headed in the right direction and shifting towards more and more renewable generation as in our mix of power production. I'm going to talk about different commission renewable policy programs that are in effect or that we're working on currently, including the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the procurement by the Commission of Renewable Energy, the Community community-based renewable energy program, ocean energy and tidal projects, net energy billing, and the Northern Main Line and Generation project, which I'll get to in a moment. To start with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, what we call the RPS, it's got a long history. Back in 1997, the legislature established a requirement that 30% of Maine's usage of electricity be satisfied by renewable or efficient resources. In 1997, that sounded like a pretty aggressive goal, and if you compared us to other states around the country, that was a relatively high number compared to what other states were requiring. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we had already had a fair amount of renewable generation in 1997, so that 30% requirement really didn't drive much in the way of new investment. By itself, it didn't. In 2005, the legislature added a new requirement for what we call Class 1 renewable generation. It had to be new renewable generation serving up to 10% of load by 2017. So that triggered a little bit more in terms of the way of investment to meet that requirement, although that law allowed existing generators who were in existence before 2005 to qualify if they went through some form of refurbishment of their facilities. And several of Maine's larger biomass plants were refurbished or rebuilt essentially, and thus they qualified, which consumed a lot of that 10% requirement. So it didn't have as much impact as we thought it might. In 2019, the legislature passed a requirement for what we call the Class 1A resources, requiring new renewable resources meet 40% of Maine's load by 2030, and that's triggering more investment and creating more of a market for that new renewable generation. Procurement, the legislature, through two separate statutory provisions, has required the PUC to solicit proposals for new, these are really grid scale or large renewable projects, and to order the utilities, CMP and Versant, to enter into long-term contracts with those projects. The purpose for the long-term contracts, they're typically 20 years, is to facilitate the financing of the construction of those generation projects. So the first group are under the section in the statute 3210C, and these were initiated going back around, I don't remember the exact year, even though I worked on the first one, but it would have been around 2010-ish in that time period. And through that program, the commission has successfully conducted 6 solicitations. As you can see there, Rollins Wind, a 60 megawatt wind project, a REC project at Verso Bucksport, which has since been terminated, Down East Wind, a wind project of 90 megawatts, Highland Wind, another wind project of 44 megawatts, Dirigo Solar, up to 75 megawatts of solar, and Three Rivers, which is also a solar project of 100 megawatts. So that program was relatively successful in bringing a significant amount of larger renewable projects into existence. In 2019, the legislature said, do it again, basically, and they gave the commission the authority and the requirement to procure enough new renewable energy projects that would serve up to 14% of Maine's retail load. And they told us to do it in two different RFPs or two different programs. The first, the commission conducted last September in 2020, and through it, it procured and approved contracts for 17 renewable energy projects totaling 540 megawatts of power. That included 14 solar projects, 1 wind project, a biomass project, and a hydro project. And this past June, in the second grouping or tranche, we call it, of contracts, we approved an additional 7 renewable energy projects for long-term contracts totaling another 422 megawatts, 6 solar projects, and a wind project. All of these projects collectively have the ability to provide up to 14% of Maine's retail load as the legislature directed. And you can see in those smaller green boxes some of the both climate-related and economic impact-related consequences of that program. This group of contracts came in at very aggressive prices, and so we expect that they'll actually save ratepayers money as well. The Community-Based Renewable Energy Act was adopted in 2009. This was a more discrete program aimed at smaller renewable generation projects. It was capped at 50 megawatts, and it had a price cap that the commission couldn't award contracts for more than 10 cents a kilowatt hour. It was basically filled up with the 6 projects that are listed there, and it got capped out and it's now expired, so it's been completed. But there were wind, biomass, solar, and hydro projects that were financed through that small community-based renewable energy program. In 2010, under the Ocean Energy Act, the legislature authorized the PUC to go out and procure both tidal and offshore wind pilot projects. And that occurred with respect to a tidal project with Ocean Renewable Power, a 5 megawatt project that was awarded a contract and operated. It operated briefly. It's out of service currently. And then the second was the Maine Aquaventus offshore wind project off Monhegan. And if you follow the news, you know that that project is not yet built and quite controversial, but it does have a contract in place that would allow it to generate revenues if and when it goes into service. I want to talk briefly about the net energy billing program that was created. I don't recall the exact year, but early in the 2000s. It was originally aimed at small rooftop solar projects, and what it allowed you to do, if you put a solar panels on the roof of your house, and in some hours your house consumption was coming from the solar, at night your house consumption is obviously not coming from the solar, and it allowed you, if you were generating in any hour more solar power from your rooftop solar than you needed, to sell that to the grid and to take a credit for that excess generation against your consumption in the hours that you were drawing from the grid, like at night. And that was a successful program for small, under 600 kW, so fairly small projects. But in 2019, the legislature expanded it dramatically, and to allow generators of up to 5 megawatts in size, much, much larger. It allowed those mostly community solar projects to enter into subscription agreements with an unlimited number of customers. So you could build a 5 megawatt solar farm that was not directly physically connected to any local customers, and then sign up customers who wanted to subscribe to a piece of your generation. And effectively those customers, residential customers and commercial customers, wherever they are in the state, get to take a credit for their share of the output of that project, up to the amount of load that they have in any given hour. That substantial expansion of net energy billing has led to an explosion in the development of the small solar sector in Maine. We have 85 megawatts of projects that are online, and more than 500, depending on how you count, possibly over 1,000 megawatts are in various stages of development under that program. It is, I would note, an expensive program in that the costs of it flow through to other ratepayers and will be having a meaningful impact on customer bills. This past year, just as background, most of Aroostook County is not electrically connected to the rest of Maine or New England. It's electrically connected to New Brunswick. And even though northern Maine is viewed as a good location to build renewable power, especially wind, it's very difficult for developers to successfully develop projects in northern Maine because it's not easy to get your power to the New England market to sell that power. To address that problem, the legislature directed the commission to issue an RFP to effectively build a big transmission line that would connect future generation in northern Maine to the ISO New England grid, or to the rest of Maine and New England. and also directed us to issue an RFP for the renewable generation projects in northern Maine that would be connected to that line. And we're obligated to enter contracts for the line and for the generation by November 1 of the coming year of 2022. This is a program, beneficial electrification of the transportation sector, where the legislature gave the commission the authority to initiate certain pilot programs to support beneficial electrification. And the commission has already approved 3 CMP proposals for pilot programs, including 2 that will support the construction of level 2 charging stations. I've not had any personal involvement with this program, so I don't know it as well as I know the others, but good to know that it's out there. I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of the current proceedings before the PUC that are, I think, quite significant. The first is the grid modernization docket, which we opened in February of this year. It's an investigation that really looks at what's the current status of our distribution and transmission system in Maine, the wires, and what will we need to do to that system in order to accommodate all of the generation that will be built to meet our climate goals and to support all of the additional consumption that will result if we shift all of our transportation to EV, and if we shift our heating and air conditioning load to heat pumps or other renewable sources of supply. So this is a very important case to look at. What are we going to need to do to the grid to be ready for the transition that Maine has set us all on? Let me just say, I'll back up. This is if you want to be interested in participating or following closely a case, this is a good one to follow. We retained an expert consulting firm, which is doing an investigation now, and they're going to prepare a report of what they found with respect to the existing system and make recommendations to us. We expect that report to come out in early to mid 2022, at which time the commission will open a proceeding, bring in the various players in the public to talk about, in light of this report, what should we do? What should our utilities do to be prepared? The second current proceeding that I think is important is our rate design proceeding, which we opened in July. This is really aimed at looking at, do we need to change the way that our rates are designed to function to better accommodate beneficial electrification? And I'll give you an example. So if I buy an electric vehicle, and I was telling someone earlier how excited I am about getting an electric pickup truck when they're available. But if I buy one, I'm going to need to charge that. If I put in a home charger, I would hope it would be less costly for the system if I charge that vehicle at night rather than charging it at a time when loads are very high. It would drive less required investment in the transmission and distribution system. So shouldn't our rates be designed in a way to encourage me to charge that electric vehicle at a low cost time as opposed to a higher cost time? And that would mean that we would have have rates that differ depending on the time of day that you're consuming that power. So this case is going to look at what the design of our rates should look like as a way to help support beneficial electrification. Another thing the legislature did this past session is to say to the PUC, in whatever you do in fulfilling your legislative obligation, you should be considering the achievement and facilitating the achievement of our state greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And so that's a broader direction that we need to take into consideration in all of our proceedings. A couple of last key considerations, at least key to me, that I will leave you with, that I think are important in all of these cases. How do we make this transition to a carbon-free Maine in the most timely fashion, but also in a rational and the most cost-effective manner? How do we manage who is in charge, and how do we ensure that we properly plan for the timing, the location and the mix of investments we need to make in our grid, in new renewable generation, grid scale generation, local small distributed generation, in energy storage, in efficiency, in demand response. How do we engage in real planning to move forward in a way that integrates all of those different investments in a logical, cost-effective manner? Related to that, what will be the cost impact on customers of this transition? We are very concerned about costs. If electric rates go up dramatically to support renewable power, for example, that may make me less interested in buying an electric vehicle because the cost of charging that vehicle would thus go up. And so cost sensitivity is a really important issue for us. How can we ensure that the system will be reliable if it's relying on intermittent generation like solar, which is created only when the sun's out, or wind, which is wind power, which is created only when the wind's blowing? What's the role of storage of electricity, of technology, of the diversity of supply, of transmission, and of access of energy from neighboring regions in order to help us make sure that as we make this transition, we're still getting reliable power that we can call on 24/7, 365 days a year. So those are some key considerations that we at the Commission have to be concerned about, and others as well. I just wanted to lastly mention public participation. And again, we try very hard to keep the public informed. My own personal view is we need to do more. I think we need to get out more in the public to talk about the transition that's coming and what it's going to mean for the public, and how to be prepared. And we also need to make sure that the public can easily participate in our proceedings. As noted here, in commission proceedings, interested persons can file comments. They can file a 10-person complaint if they want us to investigate something. They can intervene in a case and become a formal party to the case. Can follow the progress of a case through our online system. You can attend or speak at public hearings. If you've got a concern about utility performance, customer service, you can file a complaint with our Consumer Assistance Division. There are lots of ways to participate, but I think that some of the proceedings that I just talked about, the grid modernization docket, the rate design case, I think those are really important cases to follow closely. Obviously, a lot is also happening with the Governor's Energy Office and the proceedings there, and we're trying very hard to work collaboratively with them as we all move forward. So that is it. I took a little more time than I was told I should, but I'm more than happy to be available for questions, and I'll stop the screen share here if I can do this, and make myself available for whatever questions you all have.
Commissioner, I think you took the perfect amount of time. That was a really great overview of a pretty complicated part of our state government, and a really absolutely crucial one to understand. So thank you so much. Our Lunch and Learn regulars know that this is the part of the program where we share a call to action, a way for you to learn something or do something, or otherwise carry forward some of the material from today's program. And today it's all about learning how to participate and staying up to date with the PUC. The PUC, along with the Governor's Energy Office, is going to be leading a stakeholder process to really think about how we're transforming Maine's electric power system to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. And that's all laid out in the Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait. And you all know, because we've said it again and again, how absolutely crucial public participation is to that process. So when you get the follow-up email later this afternoon, you'll not only get the link to the recording of this program, but also the link to how to participate at the PUC, links to the news and update sites for the PUC and the Governor's Energy Office. And you'll also get a link to sign a petition that will go to our federal delegation. Right now, the Congress is working its way through the Buildback Better Act and the bipartisan infrastructure framework. Those two pieces of legislation together will make really crucial investments that are absolutely essential to supporting Maine's climate and clean energy transformation. So we'll have a link in that email. Let our congressional representatives know how much we are counting on that funding to help us implement the incredible work that we've already laid out. All right, let's ask some questions. And I'm going to be really, really topical here and have the first one. One of our participants asks, any details on how the Build Back Better plan might support Maine's renewable energy goals? Is the PUC thinking about that, Commissioner?
Well, I am certainly very hopeful that it will. And I think with respect to both the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better, I think financial support to help us with this transition would be extraordinarily helpful. And there are proceedings already underway at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to look at what the grid of the future needs to look like to be able to accommodate really this transition to renewable power and this transition of our transportation and heating and cooling sectors to electricity. And there's a lot of complication in this transition, both technical and resource complication. And the more help that we can get at the federal level to how to best do what we need to do in parallel with the other states and to lean on the analysis and the recommendations and the facilities that are available at the federal level will help us, but also some cost sharing, because as I said earlier, I'm really concerned about the cost to ratepayers. And if we did this on our own and we expected utility ratepayers through their bills to pay for the full cost of this transition, the impact on lower income people, the impact on the elderly, the impact on a lot of our citizenship could be really, really heavy and really discourage the very transition we want people to make. So financial support from the federal government would be extraordinarily helpful.
Thank you. That's really helpful. This is a big deal, all the changes that we're contemplating, and many of them take years. How does the governor, whoever happens to be the governor at the time, and the whole administration, how does that impact the PUC's goals and programs? Do we see much change with the political winds?
Well, we do, and remember that the PUC is a creature of the legislature, and it can only act within the general direction that we've been given by the legislature. And so we've been given a reasonable amount of authority to begin this effort, but I think there will need to be more legislative action to give not only the PUC, but other parts of state government the tools they need to really affect this transition. And so the makeup of the legislature is really important, particularly the committee that has jurisdiction over the PUC, the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, and the governor. The governor is important because the governor needs to be supporting these efforts and not working to undermine them, which we have seen in past years, and not from this governor, but we have seen in past years. And so I think that kind of continued support coming from the Blaine House and coming from the legislature is going to be really critical. And obviously the governor appoints the PUC commissioners. So that has a direct impact on what we do and how we do it.
That makes sense. That makes sense. You mentioned the authority that, your authority comes from the legislature, and you talked a little bit about broadband, that's not something that the PUC has authority over. If there were a push by the legislature to regulate broadband to ensure affordability and access, do you think it would end up on your plate, or is there another agency that might be likely to get that authority?
Well, I think we would certainly be one of the logical places if we were going to move in that direction. I would note, however, that I think there are federal law issues at play as well over whether or not broadband, whether or not states have the power to fully regulate the provision of broadband service. So I would expect that if Maine attempted to say we're going to treat broadband service as utility service, there would be a challenge by the providers that is preempted by federal law. Those issues would have to be resolved. But I think if federal law allowed it, and if Maine decided it wanted to do it, the PUC would certainly be a logical place, given a lot of our broadband service is provided over wires that are strung on telephone poles, and we already essentially regulate much of what else is strung on those poles.
It's a really good reminder, though, that Maine exists within a region that exists within a nation, and that we do have to sort of take, there's some navigating roles and responsibilities. Tell us a little bit more about ISO New England and how the PUC interacts with that regional authority. Is it a good relationship? Are there challenges we should be aware of? Should we be looking to ISO to help us meet our clean energy goals?
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship. ISO New England, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a entity that was created under federal law, and there are similar kinds of entities around the country to do a couple of different things. One is that they manage the bulk power system in New England. So they ensure they turn on generation. They do the things literally minute to minute, hour by hour, to make sure that our system operates, that we have enough generation at every hour to meet what our demand is, that we don't have too much generation, that we don't have blackouts. And ISO also manages and operates the regional energy markets. So they operate the markets that determine which generators based on bidding are selected through that mechanism. It really determines what the market price of energy is in New England, as well as capacity and other products in that market. So they manage and operate that market, and they also engage in planning over a longer horizon for what resources will we need to be sure that we've got the wires and the generators and all the related equipment needed to meet what future demands are going to be. To get more to your question, it is a complicated relationship. We work regularly with ISO New England. We advocate for Maine at ISO New England. ISO New England, I think it's fair to say that the New England states believe that ISO New England could be a bit more responsive than they are to the climate goals that have been developed in the New England states. But that's a work in progress. And we've been involved, for example, in supporting certain candidates for their board of directors and in supporting other transitions at ISO New England that will make them work a little bit more in tandem with the states and the state regulatory commissions to try to achieve goals. They clearly are engaged in a number of different studies to help us make this transition. And there's a lot more to be done.
I'm hearing that theme that it really does matter who is in these positions within the agencies and organizations, and also that the roles and responsibilities are overlapping and not entirely clear. So, point of clarification, the 80% renewable energy goal by 2030 that we have here in Maine, who's responsible for that? Is that up to the utilities? Is it up to the PUC to make the necessary procurements? Is it up to ISO to make the right choices from a market perspective? How do we get there?
Yeah, it's really up to the PUC at the direction of the legislature to set standards that require that support investment in additional renewable generation, and also standards like the RPS that I described that say to the companies that supply us, you've got to demonstrate to us, in this case the PUC, you've got to demonstrate to us that you're meeting that target. So there are middlemen in this market, right, who buy from power plants and sell to us. And those middlemen are where the obligation lies under our renewable portfolio standard to make sure that in their portfolio of electricity that they then use to serve us, that the right amount of it is coming from renewable power. And so we as a state have the obligation to set that standard, and then the PUC as a commission has the obligation to ensure that that standard is being met.
Okay, so if we drill down one layer deeper, is there a role for municipalities to play in pushing us towards those goals, or in assessing, access, reliability of service, any of those things?
Commissioner, you are muted right now.
Sorry. I think the most important role that municipalities can play is to ensure that they are being supportive of the transitions that we're talking about. And for example, some municipalities are very supportive of small solar projects in their municipalities for a variety of reasons. Some are not. And I think to the greater extent that our municipalities can be supportive of the development of distributed generation like solar projects or other kinds of renewable generation, that can be very helpful. One of the challenges that we face is making this transition is going to require investments in infrastructure, whether it's solar or wind. We will need new transmission. And there is a natural tendency among people to say, okay, transmission's all right, as long as it's not anywhere near me. And so I think we're really going to need support from the public and support from our municipalities to allow us to make across the state the kind of investments that need to be made.
You can't mention transmission infrastructure right now without bringing a particularly high-profile project to everybody's minds. We have a couple of questions about the NECEC, or the commonly known as the CMP Transmission project. Curious whether there's a question on the ballot in November that is designed to stop that project from happening. How could that affect our ability to make improvements to the grid, or to make those kinds of infrastructure investments that you're talking about?
Sure. So that project, and just to be clear, the Maine PUC's role in that project is over. This is really a decision that's up to the voters. It's not up to us. We had a role before I came on the commission in reviewing the project, and that piece of the process was completed some time ago. The concern that I have, and as a commissioner, is more about, will we be able to support and frankly tolerate the infrastructure investments that need to be made in our state? And so the outcome of this particular vote on its own merits is less important to the transition that we all need to make than other investments may be, but it does send a signal, and it may or may not be reflective of a attitude that's going to affect us as we go forward and attempt to make the investments that Maine needs to make in order to become carbon neutral. And so I am concerned about that And frankly, I have no idea how this is going to come out. And you know, my larger concern is, will we be able to do in the future what we need to do to achieve our goals?
Thank you. Thank you. It's really helpful to hear that sort of big picture framing and to think about that, not just the question at hand, but the next question and the question after that, and everything we need to do. Understand from one of our participants that Pennsylvania has a policy to collect a small amount of money from ratepayers now to support grid modernization and hardening. Is that something that the PUC might consider recommending that our governor or legislature contemplate, that would set us up to both fund and build the momentum behind those grid modernization projects that we need so much?
It's tough to do, at least from my perspective, to kind of require ratepayers today to start paying for something that, you know, we don't know where it will be and what will be built and when will it be built. So, in concept, I don't think it's a terrible idea. It's a little bit practically challenging. I'm not aware that we've thought about kind of pre-funding some of those investments in that fashion. There are certainly going to be costs associated with the investments we need to make. And I think one of the real challenges that we'll have as a state is what's the best way to pay for them, and how much of that is absorbed in customers' utility rates versus coming from any other sources, bonding, you know, general revenues, federal money. Hopefully there'll be a mix of choices, but you know, we're already seeing rates go up as a consequence of some of the programs that we've adopted, like the net energy billing program. And as that program has grown dramatically in size, and it's clearly incented the development of a lot of local solar projects, but it's also shifting costs, and our customers' bills are going to go up as a consequence of that program. So we need to be very careful about how much and how quickly we raise customers' bills as a part of this transition, and I'm especially concerned about that.
So how does that match up with the news that many of us are seeing about the cost of renewables and storage falling, and in many cases being lower than fossil fuel generation? It feels like renewables are the best deal in town. Why do we think that they'll have a negative impact on ratepayers?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the cost of the electricity coming out of a new solar project or a new wind project is going to be especially high. You're right. I mean, we've seen the cost curve on solar, you know, has dropped dramatically, and that, you know, in this most recent round of solicitations that we went through for new projects under 3210G, we've seen very, very aggressive pricing. So that's the good news. But there's a whole lot more to this transition than just what will be the cost of the power coming out of the generator. There's all of the T&D, the wires, facilities that are going to be necessary to deliver that to us, and a lot of other associated costs that we're going to have to figure out how to manage. And but you know, you're right in that, you know, when I showed those two pie charts, they look very different from one another in terms of the mix. And part of that is that fossil fuel generation is increasingly becoming less competitive. Oil, we have a lot of oil-fired facilities, essentially the Yarmouth Wyman facilities sitting there, able to run if we absolutely need them, but running very rarely because they're old and expensive. Even our natural gas plants in Maine are relatively older and relatively less efficient than natural gas plants in some other parts of New England, and so they don't run as often as they used to. So we're seeing this transition. It's really a market transition away from higher price resources and more towards renewable resources, which is great. But there's, as I said, there's a lot more to this transition than just what's the cost of the next kilowatt hour coming out of the generator.
Yeah, and of course, more to the costs than even the infrastructure, right? Because of on the flip side, for the cost of these investments is the cost of doing nothing. And I know coming out of the Climate Council work, there was a really terrific report on exactly what the cost of doing nothing could be in Maine, and it is significant. So given those very important considerations on both sides, how do we ensure a fair transition that doesn't burden low-income earners and other vulnerable populations?
Well, I think that's really the key question, and what I was trying to get at in one of my last slides, which is, we are committed to this transition. It's something we have to do, not just because the legislature is telling us to do, but because for the sake of our future, we need to do it. But we need to figure out how to do it in a way that's fair, that's equitable, that's least cost. We don't want to just go out and say to the utilities or to the generation community or the other communities, go build and kind of see what happens, because we could end up with the wrong things being built at the wrong time in the wrong places. And so as we are making these investments, we have to be sure that they're made in the right sequence and in the right places to provide the least cost way of getting to our goal. And that's going to require a kind of planning that we haven't done in Maine in a long time. When we separated the utilities, the generation from the wires, we really got away from kind of integrated resource planning, to use the buzzword of the 80s. And I think we're going to have to, in some fashion, engage in that kind of planning to really work out the details of this transition and to make sure that cost impacts on customers, especially lower income customers, aren't too great, and that we're equitable in terms of what we build and where we build it, and that we don't have certain segments of our society taking the brunt of the transition when others don't.
Commissioner, thank you so much. I feel like every question that you've tackled here today is a big and complex and really crucial one. Thank you so much for doing this work and for sharing it with us in a way that makes complete sense. Really grateful. And to everybody who's on the line today, thank you for joining us. You will get that follow-up email this afternoon with a link. I hope you'll share the program with everyone you can, because we all need to understand what we're grappling with here. And there are a couple of those calls to action that'll help you stay in touch and up to date with what's going on at the PUC, and of course to let our federal delegation know that we need their support too. Thanks, Commissioner Scully. Thank you to everyone for joining. I hope that you will meet us back here this time next week to have a very different conversation. One about our lawns and why are they monocultures? Can we do better than that? Anna Feikal, who is the program manager for the Wild Seed Project, will be with us next week to talk about diversifying our lawns. Maybe it's going to be a meadow next. Maybe we'll have layers of native plants, but we can definitely create a more wildlife friendly landscape. And we'll help you get started with that next week. Till then, have a beautiful weekend. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you soon.